friends. Today we are going to be continuing on the Christine Daae Wishing Gown project. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, please pause here, go check out part 1 and see what's going on. Otherwise we're going to just hop right into it and be working on bodice construction today. After cutting the fashion fabric pieces, I also cut everything again in a cotton canvas and flatline these together by machine. This will help to give a little more structure to the bodice and hopefully keep everything looking smooth. I also took a lot of time to pin each seam by trying to line up each part of the fabric pattern with the stitch lines. I do this by putting a pin into a line of the pattern on one piece and trying to line it up with the same part of the pattern on the opposite piece. I always double check my pinning and look at the right side of the pieces. This way, if anything is really far off, I can make adjustments without having to get out my seam ripper. I also made a lot of small tweaks after stitching my seam to try to get the pattern matching absolutely perfect. Boom! Oh, look at that. Oh, I'm so happy with this. I'm so pleased that my cutting actually worked out. We were able to get pattern pretty much exactly lined up all along this edge, which I'm super happy with. Because we got this continuation, we've got the flowers going, and I'm just really pleased. So I'm glad that that worked out. We can continue on with the rest of it now. Hooray! Once I had all of my back pieces together, I went ahead and pressed all of my seams and serged the edges. This will make everything really nice and professional looking. I also clipped the seam allowance at the waistline of each seam, which will help to keep the fabric from bunching or puckering. Look at that. Ah! This is probably the best pattern matching I've ever done! Hooray! Ah! I put off cutting the velvet for as long as I could, but it is now time. To help myself remember which direction I'm cutting my pieces in, I pinned an arrow to my fabric so I could not lose track of that. I then pinned on my canvas inner lining for the front velvet panels and cut those out. Okay, so the more I look at the front piece that I said, it's fine, the more I think it's not fine. I've spent so long carefully pattern matching the back pieces that it just feels silly to leave the front pieces not quite matching. Let me show you what I mean. See, it mostly looks fine on this front dart because it's over the flowers, but this dart, this dark line with the white dots just gets completely broken up by this dart, which just, next to the super pattern matched back, just doesn't look good. So I think what I'm going to do is unpin this, take it apart, look at my pattern, and see if I can divide this into two pieces. So I'll have to recut part of it, I think, but what would be ideal is if I can put a seam somewhere to still shape it under the bust, but I can then pattern match like I did across the back instead of having darts messing with my lines. So I'm going to pull out my paper pattern and give that a try and see where that gets me. To rework my pattern piece, I cut out the darts and taped them together. This is sort of like a slash and spread type method. Taping up the darts ensures my new pieces won't enlarge the finished measurements at all and just makes the new seam curvier to make up for taking out the darts. This is kind of what I already did for my bodice pattern. It's just much faster and much easier than making an entire new pattern piece from scratch. Next, I drew in the new seam line, which I tried to place along the center of each side of my bust and waist, where it can do the most shaping. Lastly, I traced out new copies of both pieces, cleaned up the lines, and transferred all of my notches and markings. And voila! New pattern pieces! I traced the new pattern lines onto my existing piece and trimmed off all the extra. I only needed to recut new side front pieces, so I very carefully pinned these together so that this time the pattern will line up. Alright, I think the fronts are looking a lot better. As you can see, the pattern now matches up. And lest you think I'm making this look easy, I pinned each of these pairs about 8 or 9 times till I got it right and stitched each of them at least twice, so you just have to keep fussing with it until it looks right. And that's really the trick. So I couldn't find a 3-color braid like there is on the front of the original dress, but I did find this cording stuff on Etsy, which has a nice blue and white stripe that I think will look quite nice going along the front edge here, which I'm going to put on before I sew the velvet pieces on, so that'll get kind of sandwiched in between and you'll just get this neat little line. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to bind off the hem before I put the velvet piece on, just to get that all finished off. But we're making progress. With the rest of the bodice ready to go, I started on the velvet vest pieces. I bagged each out along the front and bottom with a lining fabric so that I could get a nice clean edge along the bottom points. I then basted the rest of the lining flat with the other edges. On one side, I made a rectangular placket about the length of the front opening. I sandwiched this in between the velvet and lining on one side of the fronts, which I can then sew my hooks and eyes to later. I also stitched a bone channel into the center front seam allowances on both sides. This way I can keep the front flat and wrinkle-free without any boning channels visible on the right side. Next I stitched the velvet pieces to my side fronts. Because the velvet vest part is shorter at the hem than the rest of the bodice, I made sure it was stitched to the same point on both sides so it wouldn't be wonky. I sewed bias binding along the top edge, clipped my seam allowances so I could turn them back, and stitched it into place by hand. I really like finishing edges like this because the stitching is completely invisible from the right side. For the bottom edge, I made piping with a strip of bias fabric and cording. It looks like this is white on the original dress, so that's what I decided to use. So this is what it should look like. When it's done, this cording is going to finish the edge, and the rest of my bias is going to fold up on the inside and finish off my bottom edge. So that's my piping and hem binding all in one. I pinned this carefully in place before stitching with the extra seam allowance facing down. I wanted to be absolutely sure this was stitched exactly on my stitch line, as the white piping will make it pretty obvious if things get wobbly. This is pretty much the same process as I used for the neckline, just with the added cording step. Alright, the base of the bodice is pretty much done. We've got our spot to put closures, the front, we've got the neckline finished off, the hem is finished off with our little bit of white piping, which definitely helps you see where the bodice ends and the skirt begins, so that's very nice. Next, I think I'm going to work on sleeves and the collar, and then we'll get started on the underskirt. So far, so good. The collar is made up of 4 layers: stiff stuff, muslin inner lining, velvet, and a lining. I flatlined the first 3 layers together and stitched the center back seam, then added some of the same piping trim I used on the bodice along the bottom edge of the collar. I then bagged this out with the lining pieces and finished the top edge by hand. Alright, so I got my flower appliques that I ordered on Etsy, and I'm really excited about these because I was able to get mirrored pairs of flowers, which if you've ever tried to make this dress before, you know how hard it is to find mirrored matching pairs of embroidered blue flowers that are the right size. So I will drop a link for these in the description if they are still available. Hopefully that will help you out. They're not quite perfect, so what I want to do is try to cut off these bright pink flowers, because I really only want the blue ones, and then maybe grab some thread and just stitch over the pink areas that I can't completely get rid of. And then I think that should give me just about the right look that I'm needing. So I have a pair for the collar, and then I have a pair for the sleeve cuffs. Yeah, so I'm gonna give that a try with the sleeve pair, I guess. So if I screw it up a little on the first try, it is on my elbow, so it's less noticeable. Alright, so I think that was pretty successful. You can see this is the one I haven't done yet. This is the one I just did. It's not perfect. You can still see a little bit of the pink, and it got a little thick in places just trying to cover the pink thread, but overall I feel like that looks really good. I'm very happy with that. So I'm just going to go ahead and do the other 3, and then those will be ready to put on the velvet pieces when I get to those. To complete the collar, I hand stitched 1 applique to each side, being very careful to place them symmetrically. So I wasn't able to find buttons exactly like the ones on the real dress, but I did find these, which are very pretty. They've got little flowers on them, which I feel like matches the aesthetic quite well. So I'm going to just sew some of these down the front. They won't do anything, they're just decorative, but I think they're cute. Okay, so here's how the buttons look once they're on. I did a neat little thing where it looks like they're right on the seam, but actually they're just sewn right on the very edge of this piece of the velvet, so once it's hooked, it looks like it's buttoned shut, but it's not. Ta-da! Well, friends, that is it for today. Check back soon for bodice details, sleeves, overskirt, bows, and to see if I do in fact finish this in time for my deadline. Wish me luck.